I'm particularly delighted to welcome our speaker tonight, Nibras al-Kazimi, who had an impact on me for years before I met him because I was one of the devoted followers of his blog, Talisman Gate, about which I'll tell you more in a moment. He directed the Research Bureau of the Iraqi National Congress in Washington, D.C. and Baghdad. He was a pro bono advisor for the Higher National Commission for De-Baathification. He's been a visiting fellow at the Hudson Institute. He's written weekly columns for the New York Sun, a monthly column for Prospect magazine in Great Britain. He's appeared in Newsweek, The New Republic, and many notable publications. He's the author of a monograph, Syria Through Jihadist Eyes, A Perfect Enemy. He's also a member of the Atlantic Council's 2016 Iraq Task Force. The blog to which I referred, the Talisman Gate, analyzed events in Baghdad and Iraq from Baghdad or here or other locations. And I found it, after my brief experience in Baghdad and returning here, one of the most powerfully analytic sources of insight and writing that I came across. And so I was an avid follower of it, and I'm delighted to tell you that Nibras al-Kazimi has resumed writing now from Talisman Gate again. Is that correct? And we're delighted to have him here tonight to address the extremely important subject of how jihadists weaponize Islamic history and how to de-weaponize it. Please join me in welcoming Nibras al-Kazimi.
Hello. Thank you to the Westminster Institute for hosting me tonight, and thank you for coming out. Thank you, Bob, for this introduction. And I hope I will present my case of why I believe the extremists, both Sunni and Shia in the Middle East, are weaponizing history, and how I see ways of challenging them on that terrain and inserting doubt into their narrative. So their use of history is nothing new or unique. Identities, whether they're sectarian, religious, or ethnic, draw upon history in order to propel and propagate and legitimize these identities, political parties, political ideologies. In the Middle East, in the 20th century, we saw many examples of that. Arab nationalism drew upon the glories of Arab civilization as an impetus for the rebirth of the Arab nation. You had Turkish nationalism that began to some extent in the late 19th century, but really took shape in the 20th century, which, the common story, the common remembered history of how they came from Central Asia and conquered lands and created empires. The Shah of Iran borrowed heavily from the glory and splendor of Persian civilization to add pomp and regality to his own dynasty and reign. And in the case of Iraq, you had Saddam Hussein not only drawing upon Arab nationalism, but he took a specific case from that to legitimize his war against Iran. So he called the Iran-Iraq War the Second Qadisiyah, which is a reference to the first Battle of Qadisiyah, when the conquering Muslim armies conquered Mesopotamia and took it away from the Sassanid Empire, the Persian Empire at the time. Not only that, he also drew upon the glory of Babylon. He likened himself to a modern-day Nebuchadnezzar. He rebuilt the city of Babylon, and much like the original Nebuchadnezzar, Saddam inserted his name into the brickwork. So, history confers legitimacy and infers destiny in this respect. Lots of people do it. So another way of using history is so if the first section is defining who we are, there's a use of history to define the other, the enemy, the reasons why we have that enemy. And in many cases of the examples cited here and how the jihadists and other extremists are using history now, they find a number of dots, they connect these dots, and they extrapolate a conspiracy. Again, nothing new here. But what I feel is different about how the extremists today in the Middle East are using history, they're using it as a blueprint of action. They go back to early Islam, about 6 decades of the beginning of Islam, and they draw precedent from that to infer or to instruct policy. So it's not just why it went wrong, there's citation of history and historical events, but it's also how are we going to get it right. I'm going to give a lot of examples, and if you bear with me, somehow all these examples will have a method to them towards the end. So if we take the case of the Islamic State, something I want to note before I get into this is that the Islamic State sees itself as a 10-year venture, that they've been around for 10 years. So it's not just the declaration of the Caliphate in September 2014, or before that, ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. They go back, their sense of their story is that they go back to October 2006, when they proclaimed the Islamic State in Iraq. So we have our current caliph, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, but we have his predecessor, Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, and I'll be making several references to Abu Umar. So, October 2006, they proclaim their new state. A few months after that, in January 2007, they issue a book, they publish a book. The book is called Informing the People about the Birth of the State of Islam. And they realize that what they're doing is something very bold. And they realize that what they have enacted is going to focus the hostility of a variety of forces against them. Not just the enemy, the Americans or the Shia or others, but also their ideological cousins like other jihadists, other Salafists. Because the argument that these other jihadists might make is that the conditions are not right. What are you doing? This is a big step in declaring an Islamic State, because it's understood that this would be the attempted caliphate, or resurrecting the caliphate. And we're not ready for this. We don't have territory. We don't have consensus about how to pick a new caliph. We don't have any of this ready. No, the jihadists of the Islamic State say in this book, no, let us turn to history and look at precedent. When Muhammad began wielding authority in Medina, his territory was less than the territory that we are controlling at the time in Ramadi or in Anbar. And what we are seeking to do here with this Islamic State is just follow what Muhammad began in Medina. We're just following the steps that he took. So Muhammad goes to Medina from Mecca. He draws his followers, his supporters to that new community, and in that new community he begins to exercise authority. And there are lots of challenges. He doesn't control the whole town. There are important Jewish tribes around that are armed, that have a significant economic presence, that don't follow him. And he has to manage day-to-day affairs. He has to manage these relationships with these neutral tribes at the time. He has to wage war against his enemies or defend himself and his community against enemies. So he was facing a lot of setbacks. Now this issue of setbacks is again a precedent that the jihadists cite, that when we have a setback, it's also a setback like a setback that Muhammad had faced. So their argument is that Muhammad didn't wait for the conditions to be optimal. He just went ahead and started because he's compelled to start, and there's legitimacy in starting, and this is what we're doing. We're starting, but we're also not improvising. This is not off the top of our heads. We're following his steps, the steps that he took. And they always remind their constituency and the people who argue with them that even in the bleakest of times, the Prophet Muhammad foresaw that his community, his fledgling community, would bring down great empires like the empires of Byzantium or Persia. So, again, what they're doing here, elements of it is not new. Going back to the basics, the idea of going back to the basics has a rich tradition in Islamic thought. You had a 13th, 14th century Muslim cleric, Ibn Taymiyyah, who counseled that we need to go back to the basics. He was writing at the time after the Mongol invasions, after Islam seemed to be wilting and withering. He inspired many movements, including the Wahhabi movement of the late or mid to late 18th century, that also went back to the basics, and they tried to put it to action of reclaiming or resurrecting that vigor, that vitality of the faith by going back to the basics. But the jihadists, I would contend, are even more ambitious. They're inspired by Ibn Taymiyyah, they're inspired by the Wahhabis, but in their reliance on precedent in history, they've gone more ambitious because they went ahead and chose a caliph. And again, the way they chose a caliph, they went back to the precedent of how the first 4 caliphs were chosen in Islam. It's an ad hoc process. It was a messy process, lots of political dispute, lots of political factionalism. That's why we have Sunnis and Shiites today. But they go, they find something that works for them. And the elastic nature of history is they can stretch it to fit their circumstances and make their case, their argument. And they made the case at the time that when they picked the predecessor of Abu Bakr, Abu Umar, we did this and that and this, and it's according to what had been done before. So that's how we establish the legitimacy. So in this sense, history books are recipe books. They believe they can go back, follow a certain formula, and this formula, if enacted today, if followed today with some tweaking, then they will reclaim that greatness of Islam, the venture of Islam. Now, why do they use this? Because it works. And the question is, why does it work? Why does it work with their target audiences? So there's, in the Middle East, there's a received history. There's a form of history that is present in people's minds. It's mentally available about early Islam, what it looked like, what happened, what were the issues. This is taught in school books, in curricula. People hear it from the pulpit of mosques. People watch it in media and TV series and movies. It's a popularized, airbrushed version of history. And this popularized version of history that many people grow up with is the foundation that the jihadists stand on as they cite precedent and make their case. Let me give an example. So, Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi was the founding father of this particular strain of jihadism that gave us the Islamic State. He's in Iraq in 2003. He looks at the situation. He sees the stirrings of sectarian antipathy between Sunnis and Shiites. He sees that and he says, this is useful. I can use this. This is a fast-burning fuel that will mobilize and motivate people to come to our cause. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi did not have to begin from scratch. there were centuries of this had been going on, but more recently, in the last 3 decades, we had Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi benefited from a sustained campaign that promoted sectarianism or anti-Shiism in the Middle East, in a lot of these societies in the Middle East. And the reason for that, or what sparked it, was the 1979 revolution in Iran by Ayatollah Khomeini. So you had Khomeini's enemies, or people who perceived themselves to be enemies of Khomeini, like Saddam Hussein, like the Saudis. They bankrolled a massive campaign that revisits earlier anti-Shiism and propagates it. They saturated the airwaves, they filled out bookshelves, and it was there. And you know, it had certain elements. For example, one myth that is propagated is that Shiism all started because of a Jew called Ibn Saba. He basically invented Shiism, and that's in wide currency in people's heads. You know, that after you launch such a campaign, it's going to rankle somewhere in people's brains. And they borrowed also from European anti-Semitism, the motifs. For example, in the late 90s, we had a book emerge called The Protocols of the Elders of Qum, Qum being the main Shia seminary in Iran. So Zarqawi arrives at the scene in 2003. He sees a canvas that has been primed for his new campaign to remind the Sunnis of Iraq about the perfidy and treachery of the Shia, that the Shia were invented in order to subvert the faith, and that they are an existential threat to Islam. They are the internal enemy. And then he goes back to history and finds a very neat precedent that he can cite. He finds a character called Ibn al-Alqami. Who is Ibn al-Alqami? Ibn al-Alqami was the last vizier under the Abbasid court before the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258. He was a Shia. The Abbasid court was Sunni. Somebody might say that's pretty progressive. A Sunni court would have an Abbasid, would have a vizier who is a Shia, but that goes out of the window. Zarqawi is not interested in that. He wants a poster boy to blame, a scapegoat, to blame why the mighty Abbasid empire fell apart, or why Baghdad fell to the Mongols. And as far as he's concerned, Ibn Alqami in that position conspired to weaken the Abbasid empire and basically handed over Baghdad on a silver platter to the Mongols. And of course, he connects it to the present. In 2003, actually this particular speech is in 2005, and he says, now these modern Shiites that we're dealing with, they're the grandchildren of Ibn al-Alqami. So it's neat, it's succinct, it's clear, and again, it's building on foundation. Now, I think an important element of why this resonates easily amongst the target audience is spectacle. I'll cite one example about spectacle as an introduction to this topic. So, again, Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, the first proto-caliph of the Islamic State. Today we have his successor, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. But Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, in his third speech, which was in March 2007, he comes out and says, you know what? These Christians are causing problems for Islam. They're enabling the West to undermine Islam, to fight Islam. And I, the Prince of the Faithful, in the 21st century, I am going to annul the Pact of Umar. Pact of Umar back in the 7th century. Umar, the second caliph of Islam. A proper caliph. Depends on opinion. But that's very bold. It's the audacity that somebody says, I am annulling that pact because, again, the Christians have not kept up their end of the bargain. Now, what does that do? It's that confidence. It's that assuredness that I am so legitimate in my position as a caliph or a proto-caliph, and I can go ahead and do something as dramatic as annulling that pact. So, spectacle. Let's, as I said, let's dwell on this issue of spectacle, how history has been dramatized in the popular imagination of the Middle East. And I want to talk about a personal, my own example here. So, there's a movie, or there was a movie called The Message. It was produced or released in 1976. There was a Syrian director. It was backed by Libyan money. It had two versions, one in Arabic and one in English, separate versions. The English version, Anthony Quinn played a leading role in that one. And in many places in the Middle East, in places like Iraq and Syria, at every religious occasion, Eid or Ramadan or the Prophet's birthday, they show this movie. And growing up in the Middle East, I was born the year it was produced. I think I've seen this movie something like 20 times. All right? And for the simple fact that it was on TV. Not only that, it's compelling. It's epic. It's very well made. The music is exhilarating. I think the score was nominated for an Academy Award, and it lost to Star Wars that year. And I catch myself when I'm reading these, heavy scholastic books about early Islam, about the caliphs and these stories and history, and I visualize what I'm reading from scenes that I've derived from the movie. How people are dressed, the colors, the shape of the buildings, how people wear their hair. Early Islam, to me, has been very influenced by this movie. Now, just a side note, this movie was also one of the causes of grievance for what I believe was the first terrorist or Islamic terrorist act in Washington, D.C. In 1977, something called the Hanafi Siege, a splinter group from the Nation of Islam, took over 3 buildings in Washington, D.C. I think they left 2 people dead. And one of their grievances was this movie was being shown in Washington, D.C. Salafists generally don't like this movie because they feel it's too sympathetic to the Shia version of history. And they find other inaccuracies and inconsistencies with it. So it's controversial, but it's very influential. Very influential. Now, fast forward to what we're doing here, what we're looking at here, how jihadists use history. So the jihadists also dramatized history to make it more easily approachable and to allow it to resonate better with their target audiences. For example, their flag. Their flag, I look at it, the archaic font, that seal that they have, the black color. To me, it just looks authentic. It looks like something that the art department that was behind that movie, they'd come up with this flag. It looks as if it would belong in that movie, The Message. Of course, the jihadists claim that this is the banner of Muhammad, Rayat al-Uqab, and they're fighting, again, drawing legitimacy from fighting under the banner of the Prophet. When they did their victory parade in Mosul, the parade was, of course, lots of pickups with machine guns and tanks, but it was preceded by a number of fighters on horseback. Just the way they're dressed and how they're riding their horses. Again, it evokes scenes from what I'd imagine, I think other people would imagine early Islam would have looked like, or how Muhammad entered Mecca victorious. That image of the caliph, this current caliph, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, in his only televised speech so far, ascending the pulpit slowly in the mosque in all right? What he's wearing and how he turns and his gestures and how he's speaking. Again, very dramatized, but it's evoking what people would imagine early Islam would look like. So, another thing, another example, sorry for all these examples, but some of them will be useful later. So, Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, I'm sorry to confuse people, juxtaposing between Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, but Abu Umar al-Baghdadi in November 2007 in his 13th speech, so this was the occasion of the US elections. It's clear from how the speech is presented that Abu Umar al-Baghdadi already knew that President Obama had been elected. He addresses his speech. The title of the speech is A Letter to the Rulers of the White House. The wording, the tone that he uses mimics, again, another memorable scene from the movie when Muhammad sent letters to the Emperor of Byzantium or the Emperor of Persia or the ruler of Egypt. Again, I think they're doing this deliberately. I would also want to touch upon Shia extremism because it's very important when we talk about this situation that we have of extremism in the Middle East. We cannot separate the two. We have Sunni extremism and we have Shia extremism, and they are now feeding into each other, in this cycle. And it's a loop. It doesn't help anyone to try to determine who began first, but what we have is this situation. And one extremism has gotten to the point of justifying its raison d'etre, it's why it's around because of the extremism of the other. So on the Shia extremism, of course, Shias, their whole premise is historical, and that they have the family of the Prophet has been wronged in the succession to Muhammad. And they can cite events from 1400 years of history that demonstrate the injustices that the Sunnis have visited upon the house of Muhammad, the family of Muhammad. And once in a while, and throughout Shia history, it breaks out into a form of Shia revanchism, Shia revenge against the Sunnis, to take revenge for the family of the Prophet. Now, in recent years, I believe a new phenomenon of Shia extremism has emerged, and I've called it Shia chauvinism. So in 2012, when I started picking up on these hints, I wrote an essay, and my damning evidence that I was using for that essay is a picture that I found online. The picture depicts then Prime Minister Noor al-Maliki, Prime Minister of Iraq. It's a banner that people are carrying at a religious procession, yes. And it says, support the Mukhtar of our age. And here they're referencing a historical character called Al-Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, who is credited with avenging the battle, taking revenge against the perpetrators of the Battle of Karbala. He defeated some in battle, he executed some, he assassinated some, all right? So he's again, this poster child of Shia revanchism, Shia power. And here we have a banner with Maliki, this slogan, support the Mukhtar of our age. So Maliki is now this avenger against the Sunnis. And next to him, we have the Iranian actor who portrayed Al-Mukhtar in a TV series that was produced in 2010. Again, an epic production, very well done, 40 episodes, dubbed in Arabic and Urdu and lots of languages. Somebody put up a lot of money for it. And I'm proud of myself here in this essay. Oh, look, they've gone so far. Right? 2013, Maliki has embraced the appellation of Mukhtar of our age. There are songs being commissioned about Maliki being the Mukhtar. In 2014, in the elections, they consciously used it, purposely used that term in order to get support during their election during the election season. So that's Shia extremism again, mimicking how they borrow from history, how history is elastic, how they use precedent in order to instruct policy, what to do. Just going back to Shia chauvinism, if I wasn't clear, so there is a strategy behind that, and I believe it's considered seriously in Tehran. It's not the only strategy that they are considering, but it is kept in play, and it foresees the end result is the partition of the Middle East, where the Shiites break off into cantons, and they can't live anymore with these Sunnis in nation states. There's just too much history, too much bad blood there, and they need to break away and let the Sunnis do their thing. So that's the strategy behind this kind of extremism. So what does that give them when they're citing history? It gives them this aura of certitude. This aura of certitude that we are going back to something that works. And the problem there is that because they have that aura, it's going to be a lot more difficult to convince them that they've lost or that they're losing. Because they can, again, cite history to explain away setbacks. They can explain conspiracy. They can say things like, you know what? We missed a key ingredient in that recipe. We'll go back and try again. And we'll keep trying until we get it right, because this is the recipe book. It's right there. The text is right there telling us what to do in order to resurrect glory and empire. And that terrain that they stand so firmly upon, they go unchallenged there for the most part. And I believe they can be challenged on that terrain. So this is the point where we shift to the second part of our talk. What can be done about this? So first question, can it be done? How long will it take? And who goes about doing it? A few months ago, in January 2016, there's something called the Marrakesh Declaration. So Marrakesh is in Morocco. A number of, I believe, 300 Islamic scholars gathered. The big thing that they did was they reaffirmed the Charter of Medina. What is the Charter of Medina? Charter of Medina is this code or this text through which Muhammad codified his relationship with minorities, principally the Jews in this case. And the well-meaning, moderate Islamic scholars in Marrakesh were saying that the Islamic State has gone too far against the Christians and the other minorities, and we are reaffirming that charter because that's the legitimate Islam. That's the correct Islam, and that's what we need to go back to. The problem is they're challenging their moderate Muslims versus extremist Muslims, and they're challenging each other on the terrain of history. And then they start nitpicking amongst themselves about the interpretation of this Charter of Medina. Are you reading it right? And the jihadists are enabled or empowered by saying things like, look, we're reading it literally. This is exactly what it says. It doesn't, we're not prevaricating saying, oh, it fit that time of Medina, or we need to tone it down a little bit. We're following it to the letter. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, the retired Archbishop of Washington, was very happy about this Marrakesh Declaration. And he said something, this is a quote, "This declaration can change the whole face of Islam." Then he walks it back a bit and says, not change it, but bring it back to where it was. I have a problem with where it was. Because where it was is that solid ground, is that solid terrain that the extremists have used as a springboard to more bolder, more ambitious, audacious ventures. And I ask myself, why take this Charter of Medina at face value? Sure, let's have modern Muslims have this argument, this deliberation about interpretation. But there's another thing we can do. There is no Charter of Medina as the actual Charter of Medina, as a document that is displayed behind a glass case in some museum. That never survived, even if it was written down. Right? What we know about the Charter of Medina was chronicled 150 to 200 years after the event by Muslim chroniclers. So we don't have the actual evidence of the charter. We don't have a piece of paper. And what reports we have about that charter arrived to us 150 to 200 years after it was allegedly drawn up. So this gap, this lag of time, allowed a certain discipline of history, historiography, to study how Islamic history was written, or the history of early Islam was chronicled after that lag of time. And we have 200 years of hard work done for the most part by Western scholars who used the methods of historiography to study these documents, to study these texts that the jihadists are using. And because of that gap, they have to assume that there are lapses, that there might be fabrications in there. A human error might have forgotten something, or somebody who knew a particular detail was killed off in some battle early on in Islamic history, or others had tried to insert certain things into the historical record. So, when it comes to the Charter of Medina, 200 years of debate and discourse amongst these scholars, Western scholars, some people say believe it to be authentic, it's a unitary document. Some people say, no, look at it, it's clearly a number of different documents that have been amalgamated into one document. Some people point out archaic language, ambiguous terms, and of course, scholars and debates amongst them and nitpicking here and there. They get to this point where, after you read this whole corpus of 200 years of work on this particular document, they get, we just won't know for certain. We just won't know for certain. That's the nature, that's the lament and angst of a lot of historians who deal with that far back. Now, measure up this uncertainty, this angst, versus the certainty of the extremists when they cite history. There has to be a way that we use that fog of doubt, that angst, to cast a shadow on the certainty and clarity of the extremist message. Remember the Pact of Umar that Abu Umar al-Baghdadi had annulled? Scholarly thinking on this or writing on this leans to say that this is a forgery. Right? This could not have been either authored by the second Caliph Umar, or it's clearly not a document that came up during his time. Again, 200 years of hard work by lots of scholars picking these texts apart to get to there. Not only that, in 1995 we have a book that was published in Cairo by an Egyptian historian about it's an easy-to-read book in Arabic, 60 pages, about the Pact of Umar, and he uses the arguments of these scholars, the Orientalists, the Western Orientalists, and he expands it using methods of studying or qualifying reports from early Islam, native methods of qualifying the authenticity of these reports. He comes and concludes in Arabic that this is a forgery. I asked myself, back in 2007 when Abu Umar dramatically annuls the Pact of Umar, the original Umar, why didn't somebody come out and brandish this 95 book and say, wait a minute, there's a problem. There's a problem here. You're probably annulling a forged document. Suddenly that the wannabe caliph looks foolish, or has to spend a lot of time arguing. making the case. The flag of ISIS, with that seal of the Prophet on it, that looks so nice and authentic and archaic, if they've taken that seal from a particular letter attributed to Muhammad with that seal on it, then that letter is a forgery. And again, scholars can determine, carbon dating can determine that it's a forgery. Now, if the jihadists have an actual flag from the time of Muhammad that was Muhammad's flag, which we can do carbon dating on and we can authenticate, that's great, but they don't. All right? All they have is this flag, and they're claiming that this is the flag that the armies of the early Islam fought under and conquered. That's likely a forgery. Ibn Saba, the Jew who invented Shiism, he's a fabrication. He's a fabrication by Sunni polemicists, medieval Sunni polemicists, who inserted or created this character out of thin air and inserted him all over the historical record to make the case. The letters to the emperors of the Middle East, that again, how come we don't have references or chronicles from the court of the Byzantines or the Sasanian court or the court of the ruler of Egypt that says, oh, we received this letter from a new faith that is declaring itself to the world. All right? We don't have contemporary sources that tell us that we've received this letter or something big is coming up on the horizon. Remember the figure of Al-Mukhtar that Maliki is fashioning himself after. Well, Al-Mukhtar is a very problematic figure in Shia history. The survival of the Battle of Karbala, the fourth Imam of Shiism, considered Mukhtar to be a braggart, to be a liar, to have his own agenda, and this is all stuff we can find in the Shia history books. And again, we can cite and put a dent in whoever's using the imagery of Mukhtar to propel a new political discourse, extremist political discourse. So, we can, if the jihadists have weaponized history, we can counter by weaponizing historiography. And really, all the hard work has been done, and it continues to be done. Great scholarly works are being produced in 2016 that study Islamic history. But the problem is, very little of that is available in the languages of the target audience of the extremists, for example, in Arabic. So we have great scholarship, a great tool that we can use to put a dent in that extremist narrative, but the mechanism of getting it translated and having it propagated and having it popularized on the other end towards the audiences of the Middle East, we don't yet have that ability. So I'm going to finish just by talking about this target audience. I mean, we're trying to do polemical judo with extremists. We're trying to use their strength, that solid ground that they stand on. We want to turn it against them. But why? Our image of this, an ISIS or an Islamic State recruit is somebody who lives a life of smoking dope, being in and out of prison, riddled with tattoos, all right, and sees fighters with Kalashnikovs in a video and says, oh, that's cool, I want to be part of it. Sure, there are these kinds of recruits, but there's a different kind of recruit who's not just an angry young man. It's an angry young man with a master's degree. And this is why this strain of jihadism worries me more. It's not just nihilistic. They're not just tearing down the old order. They're not just lashing out. They seek to build something new. And of course, they legitimize what they're doing by citing precedent, but they have a vision. They're projecting a vision. They're saying, we're following a blueprint that will take us back to redemption, to greatness, to empire. And to do that, in order to get that really moving, they need an infrastructure of talent. They need to draw people who will become the doctors, the engineers, the IT specialists, the media specialists of this new imperial venture. Financiers, you name it. And these people would be the mid-level management of the jihadist venture. Again, there's another problematic aspect, which is once you have this big pool of talent, then you can kill off a lot of people from the very top, through drone strikes, through all sorts of other targeted assassinations. But once they have that pool and they have that pipeline of talent from middle management, then they can replenish their leadership quite quickly. And that's dangerous. That's also different from previous forms of, or previous jihadist organizations that we have seen. So I believe that this kind of audience, this kind of talent, needs a more cerebral approach and a more cerebral intervention in how they think about or how they digest the extremist message. We need to get in there with something, with a way of engendering critical thought. And if the jihadists are using history and this person is being influenced by that argument of history, then we can insert some doubt into this person's thinking, have them feel that they're being manipulated by propaganda, by people who are stretching history in a certain way. And we need to get this person to hesitate from taking that snap decision of going off and joining the Islamic State or another form of extremism. So that's who we're after, and that's why we should employ historiography as a weapon to beat these extremists. Thank you. So, questions?
So when would you say you started getting extant real documents? You talked about the carbon dating and things like that. When are Western scholars or any scholars sure that this really is important and can be verified as coming from that period? About when, do you know?
As relates specifically to history,
Yeah, as it relates to the kind of the subject you're talking about, things that relate to the Quran that are important. We know it's well before the likes of Ibn Taymiyyah, but about when, maybe in the 9th century?
Dome of the Rock.
yes, Dome of the Rock, the inscriptions there, but as chronicles of history,
Yeah,
we're really talking about people like Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, and this is happening 150 to 200 years. The actual hard work of jotting down what, for the most part, was an oral stories about early Islam that were transferred orally from one generation to the next. There might be some evidence that some of this was written up earlier. We have references to snippets here and there, nothing of the size of a big history of early Islam or comprehensive, but again, almost nothing of that has survived in that gap period or has reached us in the modern age as a manuscript or something that we can point to and say, oh, this is the first time it's been written.
Historically speaking, can you talk a little bit about how the current Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi models himself and what he's doing, the reformation that he believes that he's conducting, or revival perhaps, modeling himself on the first Abu Bakr, the first caliph, and the Widow Wars?
I don't know if when they picked Abu Bakr as his name, because he's Abu Du'a, he was known back in the day when he was not the caliph as Abu Du'a. So I don't know why they picked Abu Bakr as his name when they announced him or proclaimed him as the successor in 2010 to Abu Umar. It might have been something to that, but again, it could be that Abu Bakr is a hated figure in Shiism. and this is just sort of poking the eye of Shiism like that. Now, when it comes to the Ridda wars and what Abu Bakr did, they cite a lot of this material. They cite a lot of this material to justify waging war specifically against these ideological cousins, other Salafists, other jihadist groups that should have pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, at least in their view, but prevaricated, rejected, started fighting the Islamic State. So they do draw upon these sites of source, this kind of sourcing. Interestingly, the narratives coming out from places like Saudi Arabia in denouncing the Islamic State also go back to this kind of language, to this kind of appellation, murtaddin or khawarij or these things. So this is all, the first 60 years of Islam are still in wide currency from every side, from the jihadists themselves like Abu Bakr and from his enemies. And they're still using the same slanderous, or what they consider to be slanderous, appellations at each other. Did that? It's a big topic. It's a big topic, and if you want to specify, or if you.
Well, I was thinking in terms of why this Abu Bakr, the current Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, is going after, first of all, the internal Muslim population before he has turned to the external, kuffar population, us, the West, in order, as the first Abu Bakr did, to purify it, to revive the original spirit, the original fidelity to Muhammad, and to the Quran, to Islam.
Okay, so before we get to the external enemy, there are many grades of the internal enemy. So the internal enemy, the Shiites are an internal enemy, that's very clear. But to answer your question specifically, so back in 2006, when they proclaimed the Islamic State, I maintain that they were defeated back then, not because of the surge or the tribal councils, the awakening councils. They were defeated because these other Salafists, these other ideological cousins, felt that this was too much and this has to be nipped in the bud. And of course, the jihadists, the heirs of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, who went on to declare the Islamic State in Iraq at the time, they felt that because we've leapt forward, because we've taken jihad to the next step, then everybody else should fall in line and pledge allegiance to us. So that initial fight, that initial schism, and the bloodletting that happened between them and other organizations like the Islamic Army of Iraq, Jaish al-Mujahideen, Ansar al-Islam, these kinds of groups, that bloodletting actually weakened all of these factions and provided the room, the vacuum, for something like the surge and the tribal councils to fill and hold territory. So they're very mindful that they're going to get pushback from these ideological cousins, and they're going to fight them. And again, they would cite these kinds of schisms that occurred in early Islam, not just the Murtaddin, but all sorts of civil wars that broke out in early Islam, to say that we have to do this because this is a necessary step towards what came later, which are the big Islamic conquests.
If I might say, it appears that people who create doubt in the Islamic world can get into a lot of trouble. Just take a figure like the notable Egyptian scholar, Nasr Abu Zaid, in simply examining linguistic influences on the Quran, under which is a reopening of the question that it was perhaps created and hasn't existed co-eternally with Allah, earned him the label of apostate, and his wife was ordered by an Egyptian
Mhm.
In other words, it seems that the premise for the success of your approach is that you would need a population that would accept the criteria you're trying to apply.
Mhm.
And there seem to be many examples of when someone has tried that, it hasn't so much as created doubt as excluded them.
Mhm.
So how would, so that I'm creating some doubt here myself.
Well, the approach that I'm suggesting is far more cowardly than what Nasser Abu Zaid has done. So the room that I see for doing this is you're not going after the Quran, you're not going after the early companions, so you're not passing judgment. You're actually passing judgment on the people who came down and started writing this history, the chroniclers, 150 to 200 years after the events took place. So you're asking, the question is a very normal question. Can you remember what happened last Tuesday, personally? And then you ask, well, can you recollect what happened on a Tuesday 150 years ago? So that's the area of doubt where we're at. We're not casting doubt on the faith, on the personalities. We're just casting doubt on the people, the natural mistakes that can happen, the agendas that can be at play 150 to 200 years after the events, the chroniclers of that history. And pointing out there are inconsistencies, there are inaccuracies, there are problems with contradictions within that text. Just pointing that, and actually there is a tradition in Islam, a rich tradition that that plays that out, that fleshes that out. These questions of this argumentation over the authenticity of these texts. That's why we have all these sects that have emerged out of Islam that spread out over time and space.
But just a follow-up question, don't you think that the introduction of this methodology of historical criticism would immediately be seen as applicable to the sacred texts, which themselves aren't extant for considerable periods of time? I mean, if you could say this about the Pact of Omar, the next thing you'll be doing is saying it about the Quran.
Well, it depends.
Or you see
It
the
depends how you house this effort.
problem.
So
Perhaps you could talk about that for a moment.
So let's say that we do end up translating some of these scholarly works. And we translate what works strategically, specifically geared towards the kind of history that the extremists are citing. I'll give an example. So in the Shia form of extremism, they are saying that we need to go and fight in Syria to defend the shrines, the Shia shrines in Syria. There's a very nice book that came out, I think, in 2014 about the Shia shrines in Syria by Stephanie Mulder. And she makes the case, by and by, that these shrines, throughout time, for the most part, had Sunni benefactors. So there you have an example whereby you take this nice little piece of evidence and you lob it at the people who are saying that we can't live with these Sunnis, we need to fight these Sunnis and we need to protect the shrines and in the process support the Assad regime and keep it in power. So I would get this book translated. And that would be part of a systemized effort. And I'd put this book's, get the whole copyright and licensing done, and I put it online. And I'd open up space for people to again, access a lot of scholarly work produced over 200 years, and keep it a democratic process, discussion boards, where people can translate snippets, parts of it, and make a case. It's on them whoever does that, it's on them to decide if they want to touch something like the Quran. And it's on people who feel that this is going too far or this is sacrilegious to make the case why it is. But allow a discussion to happen. And in the internet, and I believe you see a lot of this, especially with the advent of the Islamic State, you see a lot of people, young people in the Middle East asking this question, is this really our religion? And they're curious. They want to know more. And there's a lot of content online that is uncritical of Islamic history. And what I would propose is we'd bring in some content that is critical, make it available in the languages spoken in the Middle East, and allow people to do what they may with that kind of methodology, to touch upon more delicate topics. It becomes a personal decision if you want to dial up the controversy or dial it down. But there has to be a forum, a place, a platform where people can be allowed to do this and find like-minded people. And also, because it's democratic, you need to allow the other side, both the radicals and the moderates, to come and argue. See, with this target audience, I don't think we're going to win over a lot of people. Why I think this is useful and timely as we are in a process of war is this is not a scholarly approach. This is a propagandist approach. We need to put a dent into what the other side, the enemy, is using. And if we don't convince a lot of people with this sober, rational approach to reading history, we at least prolong the conversation. We increase the noise. And maybe that helps that person hesitate from taking that snap decision of joining one of these ideologies or these extremist groups. Sorry.
I'm curious as to your opinion. You said that this body of scholarly work for the last several hundred years is not accessible, and I'm taking it in Arabic language people. I'm curious as to your thoughts on why that is, the reasons for that. Is it environment in the region, or historians obviously they study the documents in the Arabic region. Why do you think that is?
There are many reasons.
Can you repeat the question?
So why, what are the reasons that this big body of work, scholarly work, is not available in the languages of the Middle East? Why there wasn't a curiosity to look into these works and get them translated and have them discussed in the Middle East? Variety of reasons. This is a very good and complex question that I will try to answer bits and parts of. Actually, there's a controversy that starts in the West before it even gets to the Middle East, which is this line of work, this line of inquiry, this endeavor to study Islam was cast in Western universities as some form of conspiracy. Famous book by Edward Said, Orientalism, 70s, just painted this whole body of work with suspicion that it was in the service of colonial powers, and that's how the problem begins. Now you can make the case and demonstrate that sure there were examples where this was the case, where Edward Said could question the motivation of some of these scholars. But for the most part, no, this is honest scholarly work, curious people, by eccentrics. I mean, to go to that length of learning these languages of the Middle East and delving into these difficult texts and archaic wordings, that really requires somebody who wants to know, who's propelled and compelled with a desire to learn. And we can make this case, and in the last decade or so, we are aided by books written in English that make the case that a lot of these scholars were acting in good faith. And of course, they were written to counter the last 30 years of maligning this line of. Of course, in the Middle East, moderates, moderate Islamists and even extremist Islamists understand that this is a threat, understand that this opens the door to all sorts of questions, that this kind of methodology, and they're not going to be enthusiastic about that, where you've seen some of it emerge. So just visualize this. The Western leftist elites felt that this field is suspect, and at the same time, Islamists feel that this field or this methodology is suspect. So, in that kind of environment, who's going to fund this? Who's going to allow it to be taught at universities? Who's going to allow it to have traction? What's different now is that we have the internet, where a lot of these conversations can occur, where if you provide the material, get the copyright and licensing and have it available online, then you might find people who volunteer to do translations or bits of parts of it, of these works, and provide them to their peers. Sorry.
I'd like to follow up on the complexity of that last question. It seems to me that the universe of salafist thought or fundamentalist thought is much larger demographically than jihadist, violent jihadist thought. And as has been pointed out, there will be, by you and the questioners, there will be a tendency to, of the fundamentalists, the moderates, the so-called moderates, the Marrakesh crowd, to actually defend their point of view, their fundamentalist or non-jihadist or traditional Islamic view, which may indeed, without any controls, once it's out there on the net, without any controls, start recruiting people into the jihadist violent track. That is to say, once attacked, the hackles of the entire universe of people with this fundamentalist point of view will be up, and they will be ready to ally themselves or consider aligning themselves with the extremists, the violent extremists.
So there would be a conservative backlash against somebody going to this. You know, that's
where they may.
this definitely might happen. However, you know, we have this problem of extremism without this being an impetus. And we have to also consider that if left unchallenged, this area, if left unchallenged, and heaven forbid that one of these extremists does actually start winning, starts saying, we told you so. So, the Islamic State of Iraq, why it's important to understand that it's a 10-year venture, because they can say, in 2008 and 2009, we were left for dead in Iraq. We were smashed because of this infighting with other Salafist groups, because of the surge, because of the tribal. They were gone. People had forgotten about them. And then, in 2013 and 14, we see them coming back, taking Mosul, taking Raqqa, scaring and frightening the world, getting a coalition of 60 countries to come and do war with them. So they can make the argument that we followed this precedent, we followed history, we kept the faith, and we came back from the dead. That's a successor. And we might be beaten back. It's natural to have a few setbacks, to lose towns, to lose territory, because we have the whole world coming at us. We have Iran and the Assad regime and the Saudis, everybody's coming at us and fighting us. Sure, but if it's left unchallenged, they can always come back and say, we told you so. And we have a bigger danger of people within that wider Salafist universe saying, I think these guys have a point here. It turns out they were right about forming conditions. We shouldn't just wait around and wait for the conditions to become ripe in order to launch this big endeavor. All right, these guys are right. That's a bigger danger than a conservative backlash. I did point out. Yeah.
Are there any clues about the first 150 years in the oral tradition of poetry or metaphor or adages, and can that genre even be used today back again as a weapon?
I know this is a big big topic that actually I'm not qualified to draw upon. But there's, for example, I'll give you an example. A friend of mine has been working on a secret book for the last 20 years, 25 years, and he has found evidence of what reached us from pre-Islamic poetry, of the scriptural language within that poetry, encoded within that poetry, that sounds a lot like what Muhammad used early on in the Meccan period. And his thesis was going to be that it wasn't anything new that Muhammad came up with, that what he was using was familiar to his audience. So there are things like that can be done, that kind of scholarly work that can be done. My friend has yet to publish his book, so, all right.
Thank you very
All right.
much.
Thank you.